Hello, Dr. Shin and classmates. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I want to share with you today about the myth of the Hebrew gospel and why it should be rejected. So let's talk first about how this myth even got started. So, my research question is, the Gospel of Matthew, was it originally written in Hebrew or Greek? We're going to talk about how this came to be and why this matters. Now, first, all of the historical evidence from the early church fathers and historians claim that Matthew was indeed originally a Hebrew document. This is important because it contrasts significantly with modern scholarship, which today hold to a Greek original, and they dismiss the idea of a Hebrew hypothesis entirely as a mistake or a false assumption. So by every analysis, Matthew, what we have today, it reads as a Greek original. Internally, all the linguistic evidence points to Greek, and the idea that Matthew, which is originally a Hebrew document, is untenable historically and hermeneutically dangerous. So that is my position, and that is what we will discuss. Okay, so where does this all get started? It goes back to Papias. So he was the bishop of Hierapolis, born in 60 AD, so very early. It is likely that Papias even knew the Apostle John, and in his writings, he makes this statement around 125, is that Matthew in the Hebrew dialect, that he collected the sayings, that being of Jesus, and everyone interpreted them as they were able. Now, even when you read this phrase in Greek, it is just as confusing. So there's quite a few odd word choices, and it just doesn't seem like that it is as clear-cut as one might suspect. It's possible that Papias was not talking about the Gospel of Matthew. It's possible that he was not actually talking about the Hebrew language itself, but we will look at that a little bit closer. So then we come another generation later, and then we get to Irenaeus. So he stated that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew dialect while Paul and Peter preached in Rome. So it goes on to Origen wrote. There was many other church fathers and historians wrote about this. I'm just going to give you a few. But here's probably the most interesting. You've got this Sicilian missionary named Plantinus, and he claims to have traveled to India. And when he arrived in India, he found that the Gospel of Matthew had preceded him, that the Apostle Bartholomew had already traveled to India, and there he had left the Gospel of Matthew, and that when Plantinus found it, that indeed that it was actually in Hebrew and not in Greek. However, the story is difficult to verify and has very little certainty about it. It's a pretty odd story. And it's important to know that what we know of Plantinus, what we know of Irenaeus, what we know of Papias, it all comes down to us from the great church historian Eusebius, who we are very grateful for. However, he doesn't always get it right. And even himself, he makes this comment in passing that Matthew was getting ready to leave the region, and to prepare for that he writes his gospel, and that he writes it down in his native language. And the idea of that was so that the ministry would continue even after he had left. So you get this language a lot about the Hebrew language, native language, Hebrew characters. So you got to point out that in the first century, the second century, there was not a distinction between Hebrew and Aramaic. So a phrase like in the Hebrew language could just as well mean the language of the Hebrews, which at that time was Aramaic. So for our purposes today, it doesn't matter whether it was Hebrew or Aramaic, but in the writings, it's important to note that nobody attempted to distinguish those two languages on a common level. Now, we get to this very interesting story of Jerome. So Jerome indeed is a church father. He's writing in the 5th century, and he claims to have seen the original Hebrew. Now, it's important that he's the first one who claims to not only have seen it, but to have read it, and not only to have read it, but to have translated it into Greek and indeed into Latin. So he makes a couple of claims about this. First, that he goes to Caesarea and he goes to the library of the Nazarenes. Also, by some accounts, the library of the Ebionites, and there's a man there, a librarian, and he keeps under his care the original Matthew. And there, when he finds it, that he notices some very interesting things about it. And one was that it does not quote the Septuagint. It does not make use of the Greek Bible at all, which would make sense if it is a Hebrew document. You would think that if Matthew wrote in Hebrew, using Hebrew sources, that he would have no need for the Septuagint. So Jerome writes about this when he is composing his book on illustrious men. He seems like he is a pretty big fan of this document. However, when he writes his preface for the New Testament in the Vulgate, which is his Latin translation, he goes out of his way to say that he did not use any other documents except for good Greek manuscripts in the translation of the Vulgate. So why would he do that? Why would he claim to have discovered the original Matthew, but then later not even include that in consideration for his life's work, which indeed was the Vulgate? Something interesting about Jerome was that he was unique in that he was a top scholar, so he actually could read Hebrew, and the others couldn't. So many or most of the early church fathers, and especially the later ones, they could not read Hebrew. So if they were given a Hebrew document, they were pretty much at the mercy of whoever had given them the document, and they did not necessarily have the linguistic skills to be able to read the document and to determine what it was and its validity. Jerome could do this, but he could not do it when he was young. It was later in his career when he had really mastered Hebrew to level to where he could make use of it. And it is possible that in his early days when he was writing on illustrious men, that indeed he traveled to the library of the Nazarenes and he saw a document. But later on he realized that that document was not Matthew, and he just kept quiet about it, but made sure to note that he did not use anything other than Greek in composing the Vulgate. So, with these mysterious stories of faraway travels and interesting languages and places, what explanations could we give? Matthew, as we have it today, most assuredly is not a translation. However, all of the church fathers believed it. When I say all of the church fathers, from Papias in the 2nd century all the way up to the 16th century, this was not questioned. It was not questioned up until you get to Erasmus. And Erasmus in the 16th century is reading the Gospel of Matthew with everybody's assumptions that originally it was a Hebrew document. He said, wait a second, this most certainly does not read like a translation. Doesn't have any of the trappings of a translation. The intrusion effects from Hebrew, it's very high-level Greek. He's reading it and he thinks maybe there's a mistake. He opens the conversation. The conversation goes on until today. So how can we account for these very early claims that Matthew was indeed Hebrew? Well, I believe there's 3 options. One, that Matthew wrote in Hebrew and it was quickly translated into Greek, or that Matthew wrote in Greek and that these early accounts were simply mistaken, or the third option, before Matthew composed his gospel, that he himself maintained a note set on the teachings of Jesus, but these were not preserved by the church. Let's look at these. Okay, so first, Matthew was quickly translated into Greek, started out as Hebrew. So in favor of this position, on all accounts, this would satisfy the early external evidence. Okay, so we would say Papias is reading in the 2nd century, and before he got it, from Matthew. Somebody had translated it. Papias himself did not read Hebrew, and so it would have been Matthew wrote the Hebrew document, and then very quickly that the translator would have translated the Hebrew into the Greek, and then after that, the Hebrew was lost. Historically, we could say that this is possible. Hebrew was a viable language of the day, and also it's congruent with the language of Jesus and his teachings. So it's possible. We could imagine that that this took place. However, against this position, you have to note that the Gospel of Matthew is a very high-level Greek. It also uses some Semitic words, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and there are direct quotations from the Septuagint. So how could you have direct quotations from an adjacent Greek document if it was originally written in Hebrew? How could the translator perform that? And also, it is important to note that there are no surviving Hebrew manuscripts. We have thousands of Greek manuscripts, but no early manuscripts in Hebrew. So what do I mean by Semitic words with definitions? I think that this is probably the strongest claim, the strongest support to the claim that Matthew was a Greek original. So look, he gives these verses like this, and we will call him Emmanuel. And then Matthew says, which means God with us. Emmanuel is it's literally the Aramaic name that would be translated God with us. You see what he's doing? And then again, they talk about the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. So he uses an Aramaic word and then gives the explanation in Greek. If this was an Aramaic or Hebrew originally, the original, there would be no need to do that. It would just be repetition upon repetition. So, based off of these verses alone, it's very strong support that we're dealing with a Greek original. Okay, so maybe Matthew wrote in Greek and that all of these early accounts are mistaken. Well, let's go through this. So the early accounts assume Hebrew because of location. That's very possible. I think that there was not a clear understanding, even in the ancient world, of how much Greek was actually spoken in Judea at that time. Maybe Papias was simply mistaken based off of the information that he had at hand, and the others just simply didn't check it, and they followed along with him. So it was assumed, possibly, that Matthew, as a Galilean Jew, that he would not know advanced Greek. But it's also important to remember that Matthew would have he would have done his day-to-day work in Greek as he was working with the Eastern Roman Empire, which operated in Greek. So in his accounting work, in his tax collecting, that he would have used Greek for his reports. So he's like a kind of a business scribe, would have been very familiar with Greek. But also these early church fathers, they lacked the comparative linguistic skills to really dig into the Greek and to be able to see that it was an original from the linguistic evidence. So against this idea, so this would be supporting the positions of the early fathers, is these writers were much, much closer to the source. Also, we know that they had access to texts that are now lost, especially Eusebius, and likely Papias and Irenaeus had contact with at least the Apostle John. So they're even close to the people, and geographically they're very, very near the source. So if anybody were to get it right, then you would assume that it would be them. Okay, so now we have the third option. So before Matthew actually composed his gospel, that he maintained a note set on the teachings of Jesus. This is an appealing story, and it would satisfy the questions being asked. However, this is an argument from silence, and it lacks any textual evidence. We simply don't have any specific reason to believe this. There are many ancient documents floating around the ancient world, but to be able to prove that these were from the hand of Matthew. It is possible. In some ways, it's reasonable, but it is not conclusive. So this idea has been presented by several scholars, many in fact, but without the evidence, it's just simply trying to answer a question with another set of questions. So my conclusion, the evidence points to Matthew as a Greek original text. The early accounts most certainly could have been referring to some type of non-canonical documents, but this is impossible to prove. The best answer, Matthew was written in Greek. To believe otherwise is historically inaccurate and undermines the foundations of the authority of Scripture. Without an accurate and clear source text as a reference, any translation is anchored in a foreign culture and setting of these writers, these translators, and such documents have little claim to convey the original author's meaning. Now, how does this affect us? If we don't believe that Matthew was written in Greek, then what we read in English is a translation of a translation, possibly of another translation. Translation indeed is interpretation. We are blessed as Christians to have such a robust repository of Greek text, thousands of Greek text that we are able to use to be able to check and to recheck. And if we don't have that, then we have seriously undermined the authority and the doctrine of the inerrancy of Scripture in the case of the gospel of Matthew. Thank you.